Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
Well, they did it. They finally elected a new Speaker of the House. Is that a big deal? Should it be?
So, Dave, I got an email today from the new Speaker. And
Oh, no kidding.
yes, I thought at first, I was a little offended he didn't congratulate me on the new radio show. But then I realized, he's got other things he's dealing with. I was so impressed.
I give a line to my daughter, Anna, saying, your father's a very important person. Now I'm going to say, Michael DelGiorno is a very important person. He got an email from the Speaker. Yeah. I didn't get an email from the Speaker.
Well, addressed fellow American. But I was so impressed with the words. Can I share them with you?
Sure.
The most important things in life are faith, family, and freedom. That's not just a slogan. These happen to be the foundations of our great country. That's why I'm fighting every day to preserve them. Then he did a section on faith. He did it because I usually do God, family, country. And I think that, it should be in that order, quite frankly. But he words a little different. And then I can't tell you, and I don't know how much time you want me to take, but what he says about faith, what he says about family, what he says about freedom was so powerful. And I was like, all I could think of, not to sound narcissistic, was how concerned you got that we made politics of this speakership. And then we found ourselves with no speaker. And now I'm wondering, did we just stumble on maybe the most important speaker we could have at this moment? Because you can't fake this wording. You can't fake it.
No, I agree with you, Michael. And there's a lot of people that are saying to themselves, how on earth did this happen? And I don't think anybody really knows. And no one's yet been willing to talk out of school and tell us how this came to pass. But here we are with a speaker. And what's funny is SNL did a skit on him the other night, and it was hilarious.
Was it?
I mean, it was sort of like they had a disheveled character get together to do it, as if no one knew how to costume him, or he came in. It's like he had glasses and hair. That was all he had. Nobody knows who Mike Johnson is. And he had to tell him like 3 times what his name is. So we are talking about the same Mike Johnson, right?
Yeah. And so under faith, he says, our nation began with a bold declaration. Isn't that where, my first thought was you. That's where you always begin. Because that's what informs. The Constitution is our guide. But, if you want to get the spirit behind it, the intent of it, you've got to get that from the Declaration. I was very impressed.
Well, and who knows? There have been very unusual things that have happened in our history. It is kind of a political mystery. Sooner or later, we'll get it. And this isn't the point. I'll get off this in just a second. But things happen that you can't control. Now, it'll be a mystery to figure out why somebody who pretty much believes the same thing as Jim Jordan did was elected unanimously, but Jordan couldn't get that extra 20 votes.
Okay, time out. That was going to be my first question for you.
Yeah.
All right, so we know why the left is trying to smear him. That's really the topical story of the week. It could be because he's a Republican. A lot of Republicans. Could be because he's a conservative. Well, Jim Jordan was a conservative, and we saw the New York Times certainly went out of their way to try to smear him. Jordan didn't quite get the Christian attack. This guy, it seems to be about Christianity because they're trying to frame him as a Christian nationalist. But there's something about him that's a threat to them. Why wasn't Jordan and if that was your reason for Republicans not voting for Jordan, how do they justify this?
So same worldview, without a doubt. Mike Johnson actually has stronger credentials in that worldview in the sense that he worked for an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom as a constitutional attorney representing clients on religious liberty issues. And so I don't know, maybe it's bad blood over the years, over deals that have gone on over 18 years. Johnson's only been there 6 years, so he hasn't gotten enough people angry at him yet. It could be that. It could be strictly personalities. It could be payback for things. Or it could be the place that the Republicans got to a point where they said, the clock is done now.
Yeah, we can't do this another week.
We don't have any more time, and this guy will do. It's also possible that the people who voted against Jordan knew that they, if he got the speakership, they couldn't ultimately rein him in or get rid of him. And maybe, and this is pure speculation, they felt because Johnson's just there 6 years, he'll get in over his head and they'll be able to control him. I don't know. These are all speculations. We don't know. But we know we have got a speaker.
Well, yeah, no, and I was going to ask the question this way, and that is, okay, from a Republican perspective, here's a guy that if we give this power to, and I'm going to do like you, I'm just going to pull things. He's going to stay focused on faith and family and freedom. We give somebody like Jim Jordan this power. We elevate Jim Jordan to a much higher level of leadership that we might not be able to control or reel in. Because I was running out of ideas like you were to make sense of it.
This much I know that, and I feel that we have a context for these conversations. I've spent 43 years, as you know, doing this stuff. But but you and I haven't even had enough time as friends, even as many years as we've been friends, to catch up on all the things that we've experienced. The times you've been on Capitol Hill, that you've met with people on Capitol Hill, you've broadcast from Capitol Hill. The meetings that I've been in where they sort of like lost track of me because I was too young to take seriously, but I was taking very careful notes on what was going on. Some of the conversations I've overheard, some of the things I've heard Newt Gingrich say that to this day still alarm me and inform me on how the game is really played inside Washington, D.C. I mean, we have a context of experience, so we're just not reading an article and repeating this to each other.
No.
I think that's what's important.
Oh, absolutely. But I was actually going to crack a joke, which is a terrible thing to interrupt with. But I was going to say, what if I was obsessed with Newt Gingrich instead of JFK? We probably wouldn't be friends, would we? That's a soft spot for you. I keep noticing this theme of how Gingrich comes up.
And you know what? I still see him a couple of times a year in places that I'm at, and he doesn't remember me from anybody, and that's fine, probably better. And I always treat him with respect. It's not personal in any way, shape, or form, but I know things. I mean, I've heard things said, and it's not just Newt Gingrich. It's the entire concept of the people who are the elites on Capitol Hill. But here's the deal. You got a guy up there who's 6 years old in the business, so to speak, as a congressman, very deep in worldview, very deep in constitutional law and litigation, very bright and exceptionally articulate. Now, this is going to be interesting to watch what Mike Johnson does.
Well, because if I was in charge of this hiring, this candidate slipped by me, and he'd have been my first choice because I am all about worldview. It informs everything. I would say it this way, and I don't want to sound critical, but I can tell. I notice when people are using faith. I notice when people are using patriotism. And you can see the writing all the way up to president. You can tell when a speechwriter's doing it. But I mean, members of Congress from certain constituents do it all the time. And I can see through it. What I want to make clear to you is when I was reading this email, you don't fake words like that. I can tell by the order. I can tell by the context. Now, I'm also familiar with the Alliance Defense Fund and all the work that he's done. So I know he gets Constitution, and I know his worldview is rock solid. But like when you said earlier, and a powerful eloquence. So to your point,
yeah,
how effective might he be to do things way beyond getting votes?
Well, here's the question. Who's going to write a speech for him?
Not me.
And the last time we had a speaker that wrote his own speeches was Newt Gingrich.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, the last time we've had a major political figure in America who wrote his own speeches was Newt Gingrich.
Oh, Sorensen even wrote most of JFK's, although JFK with a pen wrote a lot of it.
And they do, and obviously they do edit, but there's a lot of this stuff where they're editing. It's not the bones. I have a hard time believing that Mike Johnson will ever need to hire a speechwriter.
No.
I don't know how his grammar is. He might need spell check, but he doesn't need somebody to put the sentence structure together.
Well, let me pose a different question. So here we are trying to understand this from the Republican perspective. Okay, so this guy wasn't good, but this guy who believes the exact same things and comes from the same, he is. All right, and then the Democrats, we get why they're trying to smear him and what they potentially fear. We're going to dust that out in depth. How might the American people respond to a speaker like this?
Hopefully not much at all, because the Speaker of the House of the United States should not really be a super celebrity figure. He should not be a controlling political light. That's not the job of the speaker. The job of the speaker is to keep the trains running on time.
Don't you watch the same cable I do? There's the president of the United States and there's the Speaker of the House, right?
Tip O'Neill was not a glory hound, not a camera hound. Incredibly effective as a Democrat working with Ronald Reagan. He didn't go looking for the cameras. He knew what his job was. It's a job that is very important to be sure, but overrated at the same time. So I think that we might be surprised that we'll have a speaker who doesn't seek the limelight here.
Michael began in talk radio over 30 years ago. David has been working in the field of public policy and media for over 40 years. They've been around and seen a lot. To learn more about Michael and David, visit 1850mainstreet.com.
All right, what do you make of all these attacks? We always say it this way. Do they not like him because he's Republican at the New York Times or whomever we're talking about, Washington Post? Do they not like him because he's conservative to boot? Or how about the trifecta? Throw in Christian. I mean, that's the ultimate Hollywood boogeyman, right?
Yeah, and it brings up the conversation that you and I were having the other day about Christian nationalism. And that kind of gets me wanting to get to the plate and take a few swings because I've been watching that term develop. In over 43 years, and that's just experiential. And going back and studying a couple hundred years of history, there has always been a community in America from the very beginning that was atheistic, that was non-God. And atheists have always been a part of the American population. They have grown and declined based on different periods and times of history. But let's start with one remarkable reality is that the American system of government affords the most liberty along with form of any form of government in the history of 4,000 years of actually more than that, 6,000 years of recorded human history. You never find an institution of government like the American system where people can have so much width and breadth of beliefs, but nothing in the system requires compulsion. In other words, you don't have to be a believer in God to be an American, even though the Declaration of Independence clearly confesses as first principle that there is a creator, he is personal, he has made us, and our rights come from him. You can completely disbelieve that and still have a magnificent experience of human liberty in the United States of America, because there's nothing in the American system that compels anyone to believe anything. It's not required. In fact, you're invited in the American system to participate and to utilize your conscience and your consent and your intellect to participate in the process. So it's a kind of system that it's the best government for an atheist humans have ever found.
Boy, I just got to chime in and tell you remember William Federer used to be on the air with me all the time?
Yeah.
I thought he had one of the most creative, ingenious ideas for a book. And then the book is very short. It's a very quick read, but it's brilliant. And I recommend you can find it through a Google search, but it's basically telling you that. What's in a nation under God for an atheist?
Yeah.
And the answer, of course, is everything. Everything you're taking for granted.
Yeah.
And no compulsion to convert or be a theocracy.
Then that's a very significant reality that we've got to put in perspective. Most of the people today that are condemning the speaker and rallying now with the latest theme, I don't know what I guess in literature we'd call a nomenclature, but the latest derivative or variation of let's create hysteria about people of faith. Let's torture the Declaration or ignore the Declaration and torture the Constitution so that we can try to say that these people are inconsistent with the American founding. I mean, the term now is Christian nationalism. And that it sounds like, whoa, what is that?
By the way, there's no biblical compulsion for that either, right? I mean, as a Christian, how often do you think about, I want to rule America? I'm thinking about the kingdom of God. I'm thinking about dying to self. I'm thinking about allowing him to live through me and others to have hope and joy. But there's nothing never mind my feelings. There's nothing you could biblically exegete that would say your job is to convert your entire country and rule your country as a Christian.
Of course not. And let's go back. And this takes us to a favorite author of mine who's a modern author from Harvard University, Professor Eric Nelson. And he wrote a book called The Hebrew Republic. And it's not necessarily a Amazon bestseller, though I would recommend anyone who's truly interested in this conversation to get that book in your library. It may take you several readings. It's a small book, but it may take you several readings before you're comfortable because Dr. Nelson comes at this as a scholar of Hebraic languages and of Hebrew history. He is not a Christian. He is a Orthodox Jew. He is a scholar in Hebraic literature at a level that is really unprecedented. He belongs at an Ivy League institution. He's totally competent and qualified in his studies. He traveled internationally, still a relatively young man, and he wrote a book called The Hebrew Republic. It is a transformational book. If we could find a way to permit Dr. Nelson to lecture every member of the United States media and all of the United States Congress to explain where America came from, it would be so enlightening, because his treatise, and it's validated in history and confirmed, by the way, by Thomas Paine in the booklet Common Sense, which was the most popular booklet in the colonial period. Dr. Nelson explains how when you study the Old Testament, you find a God of consent, not a God of compulsion. People are used to the terms Old Covenant and New Covenant, but we've lost the meaning of what a covenant is. A covenant is a contract which requires the consent of two parties. And when you study the law of Moses bringing the 10 Commandments down from the mountain, if you study that carefully and quietly, what you'll determine is that there were multiple points where the people went up the mountain part of the way. Moses went up the mountain the rest of the way. Moses came down and talked to the people. They had meetings. They actually had a lunch in the presence of the glory of God as these conversations were going on.
So there were a couple of Italians there.
Yeah, and they picked up the bill. Okay, so and
class act, of course,
yeah, right. And what it comes down to is this entire premise, the treatise of Mosaic law was built upon consent, not compulsion. The people were given the opportunity to say yes or no, and they said yes repeatedly. They lived no, but God took them at their word. That's the whole concept of covenant. What they ended up building based upon the law of Moses was a representative republic. It was a form where each family, each clan, each tribe had representation in the process of judicial governance. They had a law, they had a judicial system, and there was a back and forth in the process. John Adams and others, and in fact, Benjamin Franklin summarized this best when he stood on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when they were at a deadlock. And he talked about the fact that they had examined so many different forms of government to come to the place where they had put together this Constitution. They had gone back to the ancient cultures. They'd gone back to Hebrew culture. They'd gone back to all of these different forms of government to build what they built in the United States Constitution. This was not a casual event. This wasn't a political event. These were people who had spent their entire lives not on the internet, not watching television, not listening to music on headphones. They spent their days reading and writing and talking to one another about how best could we start a government if we actually had the chance. And they determined that a republic was the best model, a representative constitutional republic built on consent. Those are the words of the Declaration. That is the spirit of the Constitution. And Professor Nelson accurately traces it back to the concept of the Hebrew Republic, which is something that Thomas Paine affirms in the most famous pamphlet of the colonial era called Common Sense. So this entire conversation is fundamental to the American mindset and the American worldview, to the American premise and the American promise.
And unless you're unstudied or ignorant, you would have no way of knowing that, or as you're pounded over the head every day, it's a democracy. We're losing our democracy. It's a democracy. Let alone, there couldn't possibly be such a thing as a Christian nationalist. And there never was, and it certainly wasn't the intent here.
Well, that couldn't be. You're exactly right. Now, what is happening? Because many of the people that are writing this thing have a lot of academic credentials, or they're journalists. I'll let that just sit for a second. And what happened to them? Well, they went to school also. They have degrees. Some of them have graduate degrees, and they learned a completely revised form of history. Now, what happened there is what happened a number of years ago, is there's always been a conflict in America between the American formulation of government, the American premise and promise and worldview, and that of the French Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. Those two forms of government came up roughly about the same time. One was built on human reason and human reason alone. The other was built upon the transcendent reality of self-evident truth in the Creator. And they have been in competition with one another from the very start. People don't realize that George Washington actually came out of retirement one last time before he died, and he agreed to serve as the commander-in-chief if America went to war against France. We were so concerned in the Adams administration about the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution and what was happening over there, that we were afraid we would end up in a war with France because these worldviews were so diverse. And Washington agreed. A uniform was actually made for him. Now, we didn't go to war with France. Washington passed away a few years later.
I have never heard this story before.
This is true. This is absolutely true. Washington had agreed to come out of retirement one more time to be commander-in-chief. Yeah. And I think as the story goes, this part I'm not positive on, the other I am, is I think he was going to select Alexander Hamilton to be his commanding general at that time. And then, of course, both men died.
And only one got a Broadway show.
Yeah. Well, actually, they're both run the same show. So.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Now, I know we've just started, and I barely feel like the conversation's begun. We're out of coffee. We've got to come back on this because it's one thing to understand the history, but it's another thing to deal with the imminence of the threat and the distorted politics that follows it.
And how it affects us all.
This conversation isn't over yet, so come on back next time and pull up a chair at 1850 Main Street. To help spread the word, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit 1850mainstreet.com. We'll see you soon.